Welcome to a journey into one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Using advanced AI technology, we have transformed archival photographs, newspaper illustrations, and medical records into photorealistic scenes. Today, you won't just hear about the Spanish flu of 1918. You will see it. You will walk the quarantined streets of American cities, stand in overwhelmed hospital wards where nurses worked until they collapsed, and witness the invisible enemy that killed more people in 2 years than the 4 years of World War I combined. In the spring of 1918, something began moving through the world that no one could see. It started quietly. At Camp Funston in Kansas, a military cook reported to the infirmary complaining of a fever, headache, and sore throat. By noon, over 100 soldiers had appeared with identical symptoms. By week's end, the camp hospital had admitted 500 men. The doctors, accustomed to the usual illnesses of military life, were not yet alarmed. Influenza was common. It passed through barracks every winter, inconvenient but rarely fatal. What they didn't understand was that this was different. The virus, a mutated strain of H1N1, was unusually aggressive. It didn't behave like seasonal flu. It struck the young and healthy with the same force it struck the elderly and weak. Soldiers in their prime, men who could march 20 miles with full packs, were dead within 48 hours of their first symptoms. But in the spring of 1918, the world's attention was elsewhere. The Great War was entering its final, desperate year. Millions of men were packed into trenches across Europe, living in conditions that turned human bodies into perfect incubation chambers. Ships crossed the Atlantic daily, carrying fresh American troops to the Western Front. Each vessel was a sealed environment where the virus could spread unchecked, mutating with each new host. The first wave of Spanish flu was deceptive. It killed, but not in numbers that stood out against the daily carnage of war. Newspapers were censored. Governments didn't want to report anything that might damage morale or give the enemy an advantage. So the illness spread in silence, moving from camp to camp, port to port, trench to trench. By summer, it had circled the globe. It appeared in the factories of Manchester, the streets of Bombay, the villages of rural China. It moved faster than any pandemic in history because the world, for the first time, was truly connected. Railroads, steamships, and the mass movement of soldiers created highways for the virus that medieval plagues could never have imagined. The first wave subsided in July. Doctors congratulated themselves. The illness had been manageable. Mortality rates, while concerning, were not catastrophic. They believed the worst had passed. They were catastrophically wrong. The virus hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone quiet, mutating in the background, preparing for a return that would make the spring outbreak look like a warning shot. By September, it came back. And this time, it came back to kill. In September 1918, the virus returned with a violence that defied medical understanding. The second wave didn't announce itself gradually. It struck like a hammer. In a single week, thousands of soldiers at Camp Devens in Massachusetts fell ill. The camp hospital, designed for 1,200 patients, was overwhelmed with 6,000. Young men who had survived the trenches of France were dying in their bunks on American soil, drowning in their own lung fluid. A camp physician wrote a letter that captured the horror. These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of influenza, and when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most viscous type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face. The cyanosis, the turning blue of the skin from lack of oxygen, became the signature of this wave. Patients would arrive at hospitals pink and healthy-looking, complaining only of aches and fever. Within hours, their faces would darken to purple, then a terrifying blue-black. Their lungs filled with bloody fluid. They gasped for air that wouldn't come. Many died within 24 hours of their first symptoms. What made this wave truly unprecedented was its victim profile. Seasonal influenza killed the very young and the very old, those with weak immune systems. The Spanish flu of autumn 1918 killed the opposite. It targeted people between 20 and 40, those in the absolute prime of life. The reason, doctors would later understand, was cruel irony. The virus triggered what's called a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the immune system. The stronger your immune system, the more violently it would respond, effectively causing your own body to attack itself. The healthiest people died the fastest. The second wave coincided with the final push of World War I. Troops were still being shipped across the Atlantic in crowded transports. The USS Leviathan sailed from New York carrying 12,000 soldiers. Before it reached France, 2,000 were sick. 90 died at sea, their bodies committed to the Atlantic in hasty burials. The war had created the perfect conditions for a pandemic, and now the pandemic was killing more soldiers than the war itself. In October 1918, the virus killed more Americans than died in combat during the entire 4 years of fighting. The invisible enemy had become more deadly than the visible one. By October 1918, the medical system of the United States was collapsing under a weight it was never designed to bear. In Philadelphia, the situation reached crisis point first. The city had ignored early warnings, proceeding with a massive Liberty Loan Parade on September 28th. 200,000 people packed the streets, shoulder to shoulder, celebrating the war effort. Within 72 hours, every bed in every hospital in the city was full. The sick arrived faster than the hospitals could process them. They came in ambulances, in the backs of trucks, carried by relatives who were themselves showing symptoms. The lobbies filled first, then the hallways, then the front steps. Nurses worked 16-hour shifts without breaks, moving from bed to bed in a blur of fever checks and fluid-soaked bandages. And then the nurses began to fall. The medical staff, young, healthy, working in close proximity to hundreds of infected patients, were among the most vulnerable. A nurse would report for her morning shift feeling fine. By afternoon, she'd be feverish. By evening, she'd be a patient in the same ward where she'd worked that morning. Many never made it home. Philadelphia's morgues filled within days. The dead were stacked 3 and 4 high in cold storage rooms, designed for a fraction of that number. The city ran out of coffins. Undertakers, many of whom were sick or dead themselves, couldn't keep pace with demand. Bodies remained in homes for days, sometimes a week, waiting for burial. The smell of death hung over entire neighborhoods. In desperation, the city commandeered a freight warehouse and converted it into a makeshift morgue. Horse-drawn carts, relics of an earlier era suddenly pressed back into service, moved through the streets, collecting the dead. The drivers wore masks and moved quickly, their eyes averted. Other cities watched Philadelphia's collapse and tried to prepare, but preparation meant little against exponential growth. Boston's hospitals overflowed. New York's became standing room only. In Washington, D.C., the government buildings were converted into emergency wards, with desks pushed aside to make room for cots arranged in tight rows. Medical schools graduated students early, giving them emergency licenses to practice. Anyone with basic nursing training was recruited. Boy Scouts volunteered to deliver food and medicine to quarantined homes, becoming some of the only people still moving freely through silent neighborhoods. The hospitals had become what they were supposed to prevent: centers of infection, where the virus found its most concentrated supply of new hosts. The places people went to be saved had become the places they went to die. By mid-October 1918, American cities began shutting down in ways they never had before. The orders came in waves, city by city, as local health officials realized that hospitals alone could not stop what was happening. Philadelphia closed first: schools, theaters, churches, saloons, every place where people gathered. San Francisco followed, then Seattle, then New York. Within 2 weeks, nearly every major city in America had implemented some form of quarantine. The streets emptied. Broadway went dark for the first time since it had been electrified. The theaters that had played to packed houses every night stood silent, their marquees advertising shows that would never be performed. In Boston, the symphony canceled its season. In Chicago, the elevated trains ran nearly empty, their usual crush of commuters replaced by a handful of masked passengers sitting as far apart as the cars allowed. The mask orders were among the most visible signs of the new reality. San Francisco made them mandatory in public, with fines of $5, nearly a day's wage, for violators, Photographs from the period show entire crowds of people wearing white gauze masks tied behind their heads. Streetcar operators, postal workers, policemen, shopkeepers, everyone masked. But compliance was uneven. Some wore them properly. Others let them slip below their noses or tucked them under their chins when they thought no one was looking. In San Francisco, an anti-mask league formed, arguing that the mandates violated personal freedom. They held meetings, ironically spreading the virus they claimed wasn't worth the restrictions. The closures created strange, eerie scenes. Schools sat empty, their playgrounds silent. Churches locked their doors during the holiest season of the year, turning away parishioners who had never missed a Sunday service. Weddings were postponed. Funerals were limited to immediate family only, and even those were rushed, 15-minute affairs conducted at gravesides with mourners standing 6 feet apart. The quarantines had economic consequences that rippled through every level of society. Factory workers lost wages. Small businesses closed permanently, unable to survive weeks without customers. The working poor, who lived paycheck to paycheck, faced impossible choices: violate quarantine to work and risk infection, or stay home and watch their families go hungry. In some cities, the measures worked. Where officials acted quickly and enforced restrictions strictly, death rates remained manageable. In others, those that delayed, that prioritized economic concerns over public health, that lifted restrictions too early, the virus burned through the population unchecked. The cities that hesitated paid for that hesitation in bodies stacked in warehouses and mass graves dug on the outskirts of town. The pandemic did not distribute its suffering equally. In the industrial cities of the Northeast, the virus found its most vulnerable victims in the tenement districts. These were neighborhoods where immigrant families, Italian, Irish, Polish, Jewish, lived packed into airless apartments, 3 or 4 families sharing spaces designed for one. When the flu entered these buildings, it moved floor to floor like fire up a chimney. The tenements had no space for isolation. A sick child slept in the same bed as healthy siblings. Parents who fell ill had no separate room to retreat to. Entire families contracted the virus within days of each other, and entire families died in the same week. The public health nurses who ventured into these neighborhoods found scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Children sitting beside dead parents, too young to understand, too weak to seek help. Apartments where everyone had died, discovered only when neighbors noticed the smell. In one building in New York, a nurse found 4 children under the age of 10 living alone, their parents dead for 3 days, trying to care for each other with no food and no idea what to do. The African American community faced the double burden of disease and segregation. In cities across the South, Black residents were turned away from white hospitals even as they were dying. They were forced to create their own emergency clinics in churches and community centers, staffed by Black nurses and the few Black doctors available, working with almost no resources and even less official support. In Philadelphia's Black neighborhoods, the death rate was nearly double that of white areas, not because the virus was more deadly to them, but because they had no access to the care that might have saved them. The pandemic exposed what had always been true, that in America, even suffering was segregated. Native American communities suffered worst of all. On some reservations, entire villages were wiped out. The virus moved through populations that had no immunity, no medical infrastructure, and no help coming. In Alaska, entire Inuit communities vanished. In the Southwest, Navajo families died in their hogans with no one to bury them. The stories that were told afterward focused on the heroic nurses, the dedicated doctors, the communities that pulled together. And those stories were true, but they were incomplete. The pandemic killed 50 million people worldwide. In America, it killed 675,000. The majority were poor. The majority were powerless. The majority were people whose names never appeared in newspapers. By the spring of 1919, the dying had stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The virus didn't disappear because of medicine or vaccines or any human intervention. It simply burned itself out. It had infected so many people so quickly that it ran out of new hosts. Those who survived carried immunity. The virus, having exhausted its supply of vulnerable victims, faded into the background noise of seasonal influenza. The world that emerged from the pandemic was fundamentally changed. though it would take years to understand how deeply. The immediate aftermath was marked by collective amnesia. Newspapers, which had been censored during the worst of the outbreak, barely reported on it once it ended. There were no grand memorials, no national days of mourning. The flu had killed more Americans than World War I. But when the war ended in November 1918, at the height of the pandemic, it was the war that dominated every headline. People wanted to forget. The trauma was too recent, too raw, too tangled with the trauma of war to process. Survivors didn't talk about it. Families who lost children or parents or siblings buried their grief and moved on because that was what you did. The Spanish flu became a ghost in the historical record, a catastrophe that killed 50 million people and was then erased from collective memory. But the changes it left behind were profound. Public health infrastructure was rebuilt from the ground up. Cities that had seen their hospitals overwhelmed invested in permanent epidemic preparedness. The concept of social distancing, though not yet called that, became part of public health doctrine. The medical community was humbled. The pandemic had exposed the limits of early 20th century medicine. Doctors who had believed they were on the verge of conquering infectious disease learned that nature could still unleash something they couldn't stop. This humility drove research into virology, into understanding how viruses worked, into preventing the next pandemic. The survivors carried the memory in their bodies. Many who recovered from the acute infection suffered long-term effects, damaged hearts, weakened lungs, neurological problems that would plague them for decades. The children orphaned by the flu grew up shaped by loss they couldn't fully articulate. And the virus itself didn't die. It evolved, becoming part of the seasonal flu strains that circulate every winter. Every flu season since 1918 carries genetic echoes of that original killer. The Spanish flu was a test of modern civilization, and the lesson it taught, that invisible threats can be more devastating than visible wars, was one the world would need to remember.